Before we drift into tonight's tale of the Magic Man tragedy, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching from tonight, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always magical, seeing how far and wide this sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up, let's begin. Our story takes us far away from the green hills and candy towers of Ooo. Tonight we set our gaze on the glowing red sands of Mars. Not the Mars you might picture as a lifeless desert, but a world alive with mystery, wisdom, and power. In Adventure Time's strange and sprawling lore, Mars is not just a planet, it is a kingdom, a sanctuary, and a seat of cosmic authority. And among its most brilliant and celebrated children was a man who would one day be known as Magic Man. But back then he was not a trickster, not a cruel tormentor, not the figure of chaos who brought pain to anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. In those days he was a hero, a wizard of unmatched skill, and a man of heart. His name carried weight across Martian society. He was respected by his peers, cherished by those close to him, and admired for his wit and brilliance. To understand his tragedy, we first need to understand how high he once stood and how bright his star once shone. The Martians were not ordinary beings. They lived longer than humans, possessed wisdom and abilities that stretched into the arcane, and lived under the guidance of rulers who themselves had ties to forces beyond comprehension. In this world of towering red stone palaces and glittering cosmic temples, Magic Man thrived. He was known for his sharp mind, capable of bending reality itself into strange and wondrous shapes. His magic was playful, creative, and above all, purposeful. Where others used their power for control or for war, he used his to innovate and protect. His bond with the King of Mars was particularly strong. The king, who himself carried wisdom spanning countless ages, saw in Magic Man not only great power, but also a spark of humor, a way of thinking that could lighten even the heaviest of burdens. And then there was his connection to Grob, Gob, Glob, Grod, the multi-faced deity and voice of reason on Mars. They saw him as a brother, a comrade, someone whose path was woven into the very future of their world. In those days, Magic Man was far more than just a court wizard. He was a figure who brought joy to the Martians. His tricks were not cruel jokes, but dazzling illusions that lifted spirits. He could transform the dull routine of Martian life into something wondrous. He could make a boulder dance like a puppet, paint the air with shimmering light, or bend the winds to carry laughter through the halls of their cities. His magic, at its heart, was a gift he offered freely. What made him even more remarkable was not only his talent, but his heart. He had someone by his side who reminded him of his humanity, even in a world so far from Earth. Her name was Margles. Before we explore her story, it's important to understand just how deeply she was tied to his sense of balance. Margles was not only his wife, she was his anchor, his joy, the one who reminded him that all his cosmic talent meant little if it wasn't grounded in love. But we'll return to her soon, because at this stage in his life, what mattered most was that he had everything: power, respect, companionship, and a home among the stars. Imagine the sight of Mars in those days. Great cities carved from crimson stone, reaching toward the thin Martian skies. Towers wrapped in spiraling patterns of gold and silver. The air buzzing with quiet energy, alive with the hum of ancient magic. In the center of this world walked Magic Man, his robes flickering with shifting colors, his eyes always sparkling with some mischievous but kind thought. He was clever, he was witty, and he was loved. And this love showed in the way he treated others. Martians who were troubled could come to him, and he would use his strange magic not to harm, but to ease their burdens. A tired worker might find their tools dancing on their own to finish the job. A child might see their toy spring to life and keep them company. Even the King of Mars himself could be lifted from solemn duty by a clever joke or whimsical trick. Magic Man seemed to embody the best of what it meant to live with power, the joy of sharing it. But here lies the heart of the tragedy to come. The higher one climbs, the further they can fall. For in all his brilliance and all his joy, Magic Man carried a vulnerability. His heart, as much as his magic, defined him. It was strong, but it was also fragile. And though Mars seemed unshakable, the universe has a way of unraveling even the brightest threads. At this stage of his story, though, he could never have imagined what was coming. To him, life was full, balanced, and bursting with wonder. His days were shared with Margles, his nights were wrapped in starlight over Martian skies, and his people looked to him as one of their greatest treasures. This is the Magic Man most people never knew, the side hidden beneath the madness and cruelty that came later. A man who once brought joy, who once stood as a beacon of creativity and kindness. And it is precisely this beginning, this bright foundation, that makes the tragedy of his later years so haunting. In the quiet glow of Martian evenings, when the red horizon dimmed into shades of violet and gold, Magic Man could often be found wandering the grand terraces with Margles. Those who watched them say that his usual sharp wit softened in her presence, that his laughter became warmer, less performative, more true. Margles grounded him in a way nothing else could. She reminded him that power, even as vast and peculiar as his, was not meant for isolation, but for connection. Many of his most creative works were inspired during these times. The spells he devised, the whimsical inventions that seemed to defy the very laws of nature, were often woven from the thread of their bond. Margles believed in him without condition, not because of his magic or reputation, but because of who he was beneath it all. For a man so full of energy and restlessness, that kind of steady love was rare and vital. In the courts of Mars, Magic Man stood tall, not just as a wizard, but as a symbol of what Martians could aspire to be. He embodied intelligence, creativity, and humor, wrapped together with a deep sense of loyalty to his people. The King of Mars relied on him, not only for counsel, but for perspective. Where others might see only rigid duty, Magic Man could offer a spark of imagination, a way to solve problems with flair and originality. And Grob Gob Gob Grod, the many-faced guardian of order, treated him almost as a younger sibling, sometimes exasperating, sometimes unpredictable, but always loved. Yet even in these golden days, there were whispers among the Martians. Some said that Magic Man's power was too vast, too unchecked, that his playful bending of reality hinted at chaos beneath the surface. But those closest to him knew better. They saw that his tricks and illusions were, at their heart, gifts of joy. A man who could turn sorrow into laughter, who could remind the King of Mars to smile, could hardly be seen as dangerous. Still, the whispers lingered, like shadows stretching at the edge of the light. To imagine his magic in those times is to picture a world of living wonder. He could make the crimson dust of Mars rise into spiraling shapes, forming animals of pure sand that danced across the landscape before dissolving with the wind. He could draw constellations in the sky with a flick of his hand, painting the darkness above with fleeting bursts of starlight. And sometimes, when Margles laughed, he would freeze that sound in the air, turning it into shimmering notes that floated like tiny bells, so her joy could echo even after she had gone quiet. His magic wasn't only skill, it was love translated into art. What many did not realize was that this love, this grounding force, was the most important spell of all. Without Margles, without the warmth of companionship, all that creativity might have been untethered. Mars gave him a stage, but Margles gave him a reason to perform. She gave his tricks meaning beyond spectacle, and for a time, everything felt eternal. But eternity is a fragile dream, and in the universe of Adventure Time, even the brightest bonds can be undone in an instant. Looking back, it is easy to see the threads of fate tightening around him. But in that moment on Mars, in the height of his brilliance, Magic Man was simply a man in love, adored by his people, and unaware of the storm waiting just beyond the stars. His fellow Martians often spoke of him with admiration. Some saw him as eccentric, yes, but eccentricity was cherished in their society. It was a sign of vision, of daring to see the world differently. His quick tongue and a wilder experiments only endeared him further. The King of Mars often said that Magic Man's humor could solve what diplomacy could not. Where the rigid laws of Mars might weigh heavily on its people, Magic Man's tricks reminded them that life, even cosmic life, could still be playful. To those outside Mars, his reputation was one of awe. Wizards across the stars whispered about him, fascinated by the stories of his creations. Few could match his natural command over magic, and fewer still could pair such skill with a genuine love for life. He was an artist, a scientist, and a performer all in one. For Earthlings looking up from their small blue world, Mars may have seemed a distant planet. But for Magic Man, it was home one filled with family, purpose, and laughter. This is why, when we think of Magic Man today as the mad trickster who caused chaos across Ooo, it is vital to remember this beginning. He was not always broken. He was not always cruel. He was once a figure who carried light in his hands and used it to brighten the lives around him. And that memory, fragile as it may be, is what makes his eventual fall so heartbreaking. Even now, as we rest under our own night skies, we can picture him walking through Martian gardens, conjuring sparks of starlight to entertain Margles, or bending the air into songs that echoed through the halls. A man who could weave laughter from the fabric of reality itself. A man who, for a fleeting time, had everything. And yet, as every story reminds us, even the brightest stars eventually flicker. His was no exception. On Mars, the days were long, stretched out beneath thin skies tinted red with dust. The planet's surface seemed harsh to outsiders, yet to the Martians, it was a place of balance and harmony. Their society was ancient, their rulers wise, and their temples full of knowledge gathered from countless ages. Within this world, Magic Man was a force unlike any other. His power was not only immense, but it was alive, constantly shifting, creating and reshaping reality as though the universe itself was his canvas. To the Martians, he was proof that their world was blessed. His laughter echoed in the corridors of their palaces. His inventions sparked wonder in the minds of young apprentices. And his presence in the royal court gave their kingdom an energy it had never known before. The King of Mars relied on him often, not only for his magic but also for his perspective. Where many leaders of the cosmos carried themselves with solemn gravity, Magic Man's lightness reminded them that wisdom was not always found in silence. Sometimes, wisdom came with a joke, with a trick, with the courage to remind even a king not to take eternity too seriously. The Martians adored him, yet it was with Margles that Magic Man revealed the fullest version of himself. She was gentle where he was wild, thoughtful where he was impulsive. Together, they were a harmony of opposites. They could be found strolling through the grand Martian gardens, where trees twisted like spirals of red crystal and flowers glowed faintly in the thin air. Magic Man would pluck one of these strange blossoms and charm it so that it whispered songs from Earth, the kind Margles adored. She would laugh, and in that laughter, he found the strength to carry the weight of his vast powers. Their love was not just private, but celebrated. The Martians saw in their bond a reflection of their own hopes, proof that even in a world of cosmic politics and divine rulers, the simple truth of companionship could still shine the brightest. In every festival and gathering, Magic Man and Margles were present, symbols of joy and of life lived fully. And for Magic Man, every day with her was a reason to keep his magic grounded in wonder rather than despair. He had not yet known loss in its deepest form. His life had been full of challenges, certainly, but nothing had prepared him for the kind of grief that would later define him. At this stage, he was still a man of endless possibility. If he sometimes leaned into chaos, it was always wrapped in good humor, always guided by the presence of Margles at his side. She tempered the extremes, reminding him that the best use of power was to lift others up rather than bring them down. On the terraces of Mars, where the air was thin but crisp, the King of Mars would sometimes walk with him, speaking of philosophy, of cosmic duty, of the balance between freedom and responsibility. The king knew that Magic Man was brilliant but fragile, that his heart could both guide him to greatness and, if wounded, send him spiraling into ruin. In those days, though, there was no sign of ruin. There was only the promise of greatness. Magic Man had not yet become the lonely figure of Earth, the trickster who turned people into objects and played cruel games to mask his pain. He was still whole, still tethered to love and respect. His reputation was not of madness, but of creativity. When he conjured a storm of shimmering sand that rained down like tiny crystals, the Martians cheered. When he turned the desert winds into a chorus of voices singing in harmony, the people listened in awe. And when he crafted small illusions to entertain the children, shaping the dust into playful creatures that danced before dissolving into the air, the joy was genuine. It is this version of Magic Man that makes his later story so striking. To imagine the cruel tormentor of Ooo as once being a hero is almost unthinkable. But that is the truth of his life. The tragedy lies not in that he was always broken, but in how much he lost, how far he fell, and how completely his world shifted when Margles was taken from him. For now, though, we linger in these golden years. Picture him standing at the edge of a Martian cliff as the sun sets, the red glow fading into purple. Beside him stands Margles, her hand resting in his. With a flick of his wrist, he paints the sky with illusions, a trail of stars stretching like a river across the heavens. She smiles and he laughs, and for that moment, all the universe feels at peace. This was the man he once was, loved, respected, and filled with light. And though time would unravel him, though the shadow of Galb would one day tear everything apart, here in this beginning he was still whole, still a hero, still the bright star of Mars. Every tragedy begins with a moment of joy, and Magic Man's joy was boundless. It is that joy, and the deep love he shared with Margles, that makes what came next so unbearably heavy. For in every echo of his madness on Earth, in every cruel trick he played, there is still the memory of this man who once lifted hearts instead of breaking them. And as we continue through his story, remember this image. Magic Man, not as the lonely tormentor, but as the vibrant wizard of Mars, a man of laughter, magic, and love. For it is in remembering the brightness of his beginning that we can fully understand the depth of his fall. Life on Mars in those days was rich with ritual and mystery. The Martians honored their rulers, revered Grob, Gob, Glob, Grod, and looked to the king of Mars as both a leader and a symbol of cosmic order. Within that structure, Magic Man was a bright anomaly. He did not fit neatly into the solemnity of Martian tradition, yet he was embraced all the same. His quirks, his laughter, his refusal to treat power with too much seriousness, all of it gave Mars a kind of vitality it had not known before. Though he sometimes startled his peers with the oddity of his magic, they forgave him easily. His heart was in the right place. When a Martian worker fell ill, Magic Man could enchant their tools to continue laboring until recovery. When tensions arose between factions in the court, he would transform the scene into something so absurd, perhaps, making the disputants speak in song instead of speech, that the anger dissolved into laughter. His magic was less about domination and more about transformation. He knew that sometimes the world needed to be shaken gently, reminded not to cling too tightly to its own seriousness. Margles was always by his side during these moments, smiling at his antics, grounding him when his energy grew too wild. Together they became more than individuals, they became a symbol of balance. To the Martians, they were proof that love could thrive even amidst cosmic responsibility. To Magic Man himself, Margles was everything. She believed in the man behind the magic, the man who sometimes doubted himself despite his brilliance. With her, he could be vulnerable, honest, and free from the need to constantly dazzle others. The King of Mars often remarked that Magic Man's greatest gift was not his power but his perspective. Where ancient beings fretted over fate and destiny, Magic Man reminded them that the present moment mattered just as much. Where cosmic rulers spoke of laws, he spoke of laughter. And where others leaned on caution, he leaned on wonder. The king admired this balance, though he also worried. He knew that Magic Man's heart was his greatest strength, but he also suspected it could one day be his greatest weakness. But in those golden years, weakness seemed like a distant possibility. Magic Man radiated confidence. He laughed often, spoke boldly, and poured his creativity into every corner of Martian life. When the people celebrated their festivals, it was he who turned the skies into dazzling displays of illusion. When the children gathered, he was the one who entertained them with living toys and magical creatures conjured from dust. He was not simply a wizard. He was the spirit of joy that threaded through their society. And Margles was the quiet force behind it all. If Mars was his stage, then she was the reason he performed. Their love was the steady rhythm beneath the chaos of his magic. Without her, he might have still been brilliant, but brilliance without compassion can become dangerous. With her, he was not only brilliant, but kind. That was what made him beloved, what made his reputation so luminous. It is important to pause here, to linger in this brightness, because what comes later will cast a long shadow. Too often, we remember Magic Man only for his cruelty, for the bizarre and heartless games he played on Earth. But if we forget this chapter, the story is incomplete. He was not always broken. He was not always a tormentor. Once he was a man who made others laugh, who conjured beauty from the desert air, who walked in harmony with love and with purpose. The Martians saw him as one of their finest. Even Grob, Gob, Glob, Grod, beings of cosmic reason and restraint, cherished him. To them he was a younger brother full of promise. To the king of Mars he was a trusted advisor who offered new ways of seeing the universe. And to Margles, he was simply her husband, her companion, her joy. All these roles together made him whole, and for a time, nothing seemed able to shatter that wholeness. But every story, no matter how bright, carries within it the seeds of change. In the laughter echoing through Martian halls, there was already the possibility of silence. In the joy of companionship, there was already the risk of loss. And in Magic Man's brilliant, fragile heart, there was already the vulnerability that would one day be pierced. For now, though, we remain in the glow of his beginning. We see him as he truly was in those days. A wizard not yet consumed by grief, a man not yet twisted by cruelty. We see him on the terraces of Mars, conjuring constellations for Margles, painting the skies with light, and laughing as though the universe itself were a grand stage for joy. We see the Martians watching with wonder, proud to call him their own. We see a man who was whole, vibrant, and alive. This is the Magic Man we must hold in our minds as we continue his story. Because only by remembering how high he once stood can we understand the depth of his fall. His tragedy is not the tale of a villain who was always cruel, but of a hero who lost everything. And before that loss, he was Mars' brightest star. And so, as our story unfolds, carry this picture with you. Magic Man, the hero wizard of Mars, laughter in his voice, light in his hands, love in his heart. The man who had it all before the universe conspired to take it all away. If Magic Man's brilliance was the spark that lit up Mars, then Margles was the steady flame that kept it burning. To speak of Magic Man's life without speaking of her is to leave out the very core of his story. She was not just a companion standing in the background of his legend. She was the anchor that gave all his joy and all his magic meaning. Margles was a Martian like no other. Gentle in spirit but strong in conviction. She carried herself with a quiet grace that balanced the chaos of her husband's energy. Where Magic Man was wild, unpredictable, and bursting with ideas that spilled out faster than he could manage, Margles was calm, deliberate, and thoughtful. She listened more than she spoke, yet when she did speak, her words carried the kind of wisdom that could silence an entire hall. The Martians loved her as much as they loved him. They admired her kindness, her humility, and the way she looked at Magic Man not as a powerful wizard or a hero, but simply as a man she loved. It was easy to revere his power, easy to be dazzled by his displays of magic. But Margles saw through all of that. She cherished the part of him that was vulnerable, the part of him that still doubted himself even as the world celebrated him. Their relationship was not a story of opposites clashing, but of opposites harmonizing. Together, they made sense of each other. Magic Man's laughter found its echo in Margles' smile, and Margles' quiet wisdom found its spark in his playfulness. In the grand Martian gardens, they would walk side by side, sharing dreams of the future. He might conjure a storm of dancing lights above them, and she would simply take his hand, grounding him in the moment, reminding him that wonder did not need to be grand to be beautiful. Sometimes the simple act of holding her hand meant more to him than all the illusions he could summon. Those who saw them together often remarked that Margles gave Magic Man something no magic could ever replicate: peace. For a man whose mind was always moving, who saw reality itself as clay to be shaped, her presence was the one thing that made him pause. With her, he could be still. With her, he could rest. And in those moments of rest, his humanity shone most clearly. Margles also had her own quiet strength that often went unnoticed. She was not a wizard, not a ruler, and not a figure of cosmic power, yet her influence was undeniable. She was known among the Martians for her compassion, often tending to those in need, listening to their worries, and offering comfort where no magic could reach. She understood that power alone could not heal a heart, and that sometimes the greatest gift was simply to be present with someone in their sorrow. For Magic Man, this quality was transformative. He admired her ability to see the good in others, to remain patient where he would grow restless. Her presence softened him, reminded him that his gifts were not meant to isolate him, but to connect him more deeply with those around him. In a way, Margles was his teacher, showing him that love itself was a form of magic, perhaps the most powerful kind of all. When they were together, the world around them seemed brighter. Martians who passed them in the city often spoke of the warmth they carried, as though their love created a ripple that spread outward. Magic Man would playfully conjure small wonders for Margles, like a rose carved out of solid sunlight or a tiny comet that fit in the palm of her hand, but she would always laugh and tell him she didn't need the magic. What she wanted was him. That was the lesson she repeated again and again, that he was enough, even without all the dazzling displays. It is easy to see why his grief would later consume him so fully. For Magic Man, Margles was not simply a partner. She was the mirror that reflected back his best self. Without her, the brilliant, mischievous wizard risked becoming unmoored, drifting into the chaos of his own unchecked mind. And yet during these years there was no thought of loss. Together they built a life, one filled with laughter, companionship, and a sense of belonging that stretched beyond even the grandeur of Mars. In the evenings, after the duties of the day were done, they would sit on the balconies overlooking the Martian plains. The air was thin and cool, the sky tinged with purple, and Magic Man would sometimes fall quiet, watching the horizon. Margles would lean against him, and he would tell her stories of Earth, tales of oceans and forests and skies filled with birds. He imagined a day when he might show her those things himself, and she would smile, not because she needed such wonders, but because she loved hearing the excitement in his voice. For Margles, the joy was not in the destination, but in being beside him. And so, in those golden days, their love became the heart of his humanity. It was the thread that tied him to compassion, the anchor that kept him from floating away into madness. Without her, the story of Magic Man could have ended very differently even then. But with her, he was complete. For a time, it seemed that nothing could shake that completeness. The love between Magic Man and Margles was not only a personal comfort, but also a guiding light for those around them. Many Martians spoke of the way their presence together seemed to soften the world. Even Grob Gob Glob Grod, beings of vast intellect and responsibility, often remarked that Margles brought a balance to Magic Man that no cosmic intervention could provide. They understood that while his power and humor made him brilliant, it was Margles who gave him the capacity to wield that brilliance with gentleness. In public, their bond was admired, yet it was in private that its true depth revealed itself. Behind the laughter and the dazzling tricks, Magic Man was a man full of insecurities. He often wondered if his magic, strange and unpredictable as it was, truly brought joy to others, or if it was merely spectacle. Margles silenced those doubts not with arguments, but with love. She reminded him that what mattered was not the size of his illusions, but the heart behind them. When he felt uncertain, she would simply smile at him, and in that smile he found more validation than in 1,000 cheers from the Martian crowds. Their home on Mars became a sanctuary, filled not with luxury, but with warmth. Magic Man would often fill the space with playful enchantments, glowing lights drifting through the air like fireflies, small objects that danced to unseen rhythms, even whispers of Earth's songs carried on the wind. Margles enjoyed them all, yet she always made sure he knew that her love was not dependent on the wonder he could create. She valued his magic, yes, but she valued his presence even more. It was this distinction, so simple yet so profound, that made her irreplaceable in his life. There is something deeply human in the way she drew him back to simplicity. For all his cosmic power, Magic Man was happiest in the quiet moments when no spells were cast. He would sit beside Margles, listening to her stories, watching the way her eyes lit up as she spoke of her dreams, and he would feel something greater than any spell he could weave. With her, he didn't need to be a wizard or a hero. He could just be a man. Their bond also shaped the way he interacted with others. Under Margles' influence, his humor leaned toward kindness rather than cruelty. His tricks were crafted to bring joy rather than confusion. When he created living sculptures of dust or sent comets of light drifting through the night sky, he did it not for his own pride, but to see Margles smile. That smile was his true reward, and it became the quiet compass by which he steered his magic. The Martians admired their relationship, but they could not fully grasp the depth of it. To outsiders, it seemed like a simple love story, beautiful and touching, but still ordinary. Yet for Magic Man, it was nothing short of miraculous. He had lived surrounded by cosmic forces, had walked among kings and gods, yet he found his greatest treasure in the laughter of one woman. Margles made him feel human in the truest sense. She reminded him that love, not power, was the force that gave life its meaning. On the surface of Mars, the world carried on with its rituals and duties. The king presided over cosmic matters. Grob, gob, glob, grod maintained the balance of order, and the Martians went about their lives. Yet for Magic Man, the universe had shrunk down to something smaller and infinitely more precious. His universe was Margles. She was the one who made the long days bearable and the cold Martian nights warm. She was the melody beneath the chaos of his magic. In many ways, their story feels almost too perfect. A brilliant wizard, admired and respected, sharing his life with a partner who loved him, not for his power, but for his heart. But that is what makes the tragedy of his later years cut so deeply. Because when something so whole is broken, the fragments that remain can wound everyone they touch. And when Margles was lost, Magic Man did not just lose his wife, he lost the part of himself that kept his humanity intact. Yet in these golden years there was no thought of that loss. They laughed, they dreamed, and they built a life together that seemed as though it could last forever. Every trick he performed, every spell he conjured, every joke he told, all of it was colored by her presence. Margles was the heart of his humanity, and as long as she was beside him, the man known as Magic Man was still whole. What makes their love story resonate so deeply is how unguarded it was. Magic Man, who so often wore humor like armor, allowed himself to be vulnerable with Margles. He admitted his fears, his insecurities, even his moments of doubt about whether he truly belonged among the other Martians. She never dismissed his worries, nor did she try to solve them with logic or power. Instead, she listened. She offered compassion, the kind of quiet understanding that makes pain feel lighter simply because it is shared. In her presence, Magic Man found safety. They dreamed together, too. While others busied themselves with questions of the cosmos, Margles and Magic Man spoke of small, beautiful things. They talked about gardens on Mars, how lovely it would be to grow flowers even in the harsh red soil. Magic Man promised her that one day he would conjure a whole meadow for her, with petals shimmering in colors unseen by Martian eyes. Margles, with her grounded wisdom, would laugh and say she would be just as happy with a single flower if it was given with love. This balance between dreaming and grounding shaped their bond. Magic Man, with his restless creativity, always reaching higher, and Margles, steady as the heart, reminding him that sometimes the simplest gestures carry the greatest meaning. Together they walked the fine line between wonder and reality, and in that balance they found joy. Others noticed this too. Martians who knew Magic Man before Margles saw how his edges softened. Where once his humor might have cut too sharply, now it carried warmth. His tricks, once meant to provoke awe, now leaned toward delight. The change was subtle but undeniable. He was still eccentric, still unpredictable, but with Margles at his side he was kinder. The King of Mars himself respected Margles, though few records survive of their direct interactions. Still, it is said that even the king, who had seen countless lives rise and fall under the Martian sky, acknowledged the way she anchored Magic Man's soul. Grob Gob, Glob Grod too understood her importance, for they saw the balance she brought to the unpredictable energy that Magic Man carried within him. To them, she was not just his wife, she was the thread that kept him woven into the fabric of Martian life. What's remarkable is how ordinary their love could be despite the cosmic setting. For all the magic and grandeur, their happiest moments were simple. Shared meals, quiet conversations, evenings spent watching the Martian stars. Magic Man would sometimes conjure constellations just for her, reshaping the night sky so it spelled out her name. Margles would laugh and tell him he didn't need to bend the stars for her, that his company was enough. But still, he would do it, just to see her smile. That smile was his favorite kind of magic. In those moments, you can almost forget that they lived in a world of gods, kings, and cosmic entities. Because at its heart, their story was profoundly human. Two souls finding comfort in each other, building a home not from bricks or spells, but from trust and affection. Magic Man may have been a wizard of extraordinary power, but Margles reminded him that the greatest power is the ability to love and be loved in return. It is worth pausing here in this chapter of their story to take in just how whole Magic Man was when Margles was alive. His humor still carried its odd edge, yes, but it was softened by love. His magic, still wild and dazzling, was grounded by her gentle perspective. Without her, as we will later see, the same humor would turn bitter, and that same magic would become cruel. But with her, he was balanced. He was not only Magic Man, the wizard, but Magic Man, the husband, the companion, the man who could laugh freely and love deeply. We often speak of heroes in terms of their battles or their powers, but sometimes the true heroism lies in the willingness to be vulnerable. Magic Man showed his truest courage not in facing cosmic threats, but in opening his heart to Margles, to trust someone so completely, to let them see every weakness and still feel safe. That is a kind of bravery that transcends magic. And Margles, in turn, gave him that safety, that acceptance, that love. Their story, for now, still rests in the golden glow of those years. Before loss, before tragedy, before despair transformed him into something unrecognizable. In this chapter, we hold on to the memory of who he was when she was alive, a man still whole, still joyful, still human. And as we drift deeper into the heart of their tale, it becomes clear that Margles was not simply a part of his life. She was the heart of his humanity, the anchor of his soul, and the light by which he navigated the uncertain path of existence. Every story that feels too bright carries with it the quiet shadow of impermanence. For Magic Man and Margles, the glow of their love was so luminous that perhaps it was inevitable the universe would test its strength. There were whispers among the Martians, murmurs of unease, not about Margles herself, but about how much she meant to Magic Man. To tether one's soul so completely to another in a realm of gods and cosmic responsibility was seen as dangerous. Or what would happen, some wondered, if that tether was ever broken? Yet for Magic Man, those thoughts seemed impossible. He trusted in their bond as though it were eternal, beyond the reach of fate. When he looked at Margles, he saw stability, not fragility. He believed that together they could weather any storm, whether cosmic or mundane. In his eyes, her presence was unshakable, as permanent as the Martian mountains. But there were small signs, fragile moments, that hinted at the vulnerability of it all. Margles, with her natural wisdom, understood how precious their time was. She treasured each day as if it were a gift. Sometimes she would linger on the balcony of their Martian home, staring out at the stars, her face caught between awe and melancholy. Magic Man would tease her, asking if she was looking for another constellation to name. She would smile and reply that she was simply reminding herself how vast the universe was and how lucky she was to share her little corner of it with him. These quiet reflections, though tender, foreshadowed the fragility that Magic Man never wanted to face. He lived with an almost childlike certainty that their love was unbreakable. Margles, wiser in some ways, understood that nothing in the universe could be taken for granted, not even the brightest of lights. Their story continued like this, filled with joy, but laced with a softness that grows more bittersweet in hindsight. The Martians saw them together and marveled at their bond, never knowing it would one day be remembered less as a story of joy and more as the beginning of a tragedy. Because when love runs so deep, its loss reshapes everything that follows. For Magic Man, Margles was not only his partner, but the very foundation of his sense of self. He had come to measure his days not in spells or in duties, but in the moments they shared. Breakfast in the Martian dawn, long walks under red skies, evenings where he conjured little illusions just to make her laugh. Without those moments, without her laughter, what was left of him? The answer to that question would come far too soon, and it would be darker than even he could imagine. There's something almost cruel in how fate chose to draw the curtain on their love. One day, without warning, Margles was taken. The details, as recorded in the fragments of Martian history and retold in hushed whispers across Ooo, vary. Some say it was a cosmic accident, others a cruel twist of destiny. Still others, an intentional act by powers far greater than even the King of Mars. What remains constant in every telling is the result. Margles was gone, torn from Magic Man's life, and nothing could bring her back. To understand the scope of this loss, you have to imagine not just grief, but the hollowing out of a soul. Magic Man had given so much of himself to Margles that when she was gone, he no longer knew where his identity ended and where her absence began. She wasn't just his love, she was the thread holding together every fragile part of his being. With that thread cut, everything unraveled. In those first days after her passing, Martians recall how he wandered as if in a dream. He stopped performing his illusions. He stopped speaking to friends. The laughter that once seemed inseparable from his presence vanished entirely. For a time there was only silence, the kind of silence that follows a great storm. But soon that silence gave way to something else, something bitter and sharp. Grief, unprocessed and unhealed, twisted into madness. When Margles died, Magic Man's humanity seemed to die with her. What remained was a shell of the man he had been, filled with rage, confusion, and a cruel sense of humor that was less about joy and more about pain. The man who once made stars dance for his beloved would now turn his tricks toward tormenting others, as if to scatter his grief outward so that no one else could remain untouched by it. And yet beneath it all, the truth never changed. His cruelty, his madness, his descent into chaos, all of it was born from love. A love so deep that when it was torn away, the wound could never close. Margles was, and always would be, the heart of his humanity. Without her, the man was gone, and only the trickster remained. So as we close this chapter of their story, we linger in the memory of Margles, not just as Magic Man's wife, but as his anchor, his joy and his light. Her presence defined him as much as her absence destroyed him. To understand Magic Man's tragedy, we must first hold on to this truth, that once he was whole because he was loved, and because he loved in return. And it was in losing her that he lost himself. Up to now, we've walked beside him as a bright figure of Mars, a hero who carried within him both wisdom and humor. And then we entered into the warm, glowing chapter of his life where he shared his days with Margles, the love who seemed to anchor him in ways that nothing else could. But now we step into the moment where the tide turns. Every great tragedy has that one instant when the light flickers, when the world shifts forever. For Magic Man, that instant was the loss of Margles. And it was not just the loss of a partner or a companion. It was the unraveling of everything that kept his soul balanced. The story of this collapse is not one of loud explosions or fiery destruction. It's more like a quiet storm creeping in until suddenly you realize the sky is no longer blue. Margles was taken from him in a moment that felt unfair, cruel, and irreversible. And when she was gone, it was as though the very structure of Mars itself, the routines, the order, the sense of higher purpose no longer had meaning. Because for Magic Man, all those lofty ideals had been tethered to love. Without her, they turned into hollow echoes. It's often said that grief doesn't hit all at once. It arrives in waves, some gentle, some devastating. For Magic Man, that first wave was disbelief. He could not accept the absence. He would speak to her as though she were still in the room, waiting for her to laugh at one of his jokes, or to correct his wild schemes with a gentle hand. He would walk through the places they had shared and try to catch the ghost of her presence, but silence always answered him. And in that silence, something inside him cracked. The Martian people mourned too, but their way of grieving was dignified, ceremonial. They placed Margles' memory into their chronicles and tried to continue forward. Magic Man, however, could not. He did not want ceremonies. He wanted her back. He wanted to rage at the universe for stealing her away. He wanted someone to blame, someone to punish. And when he could not find that, he began to turn inward, breaking himself down piece by piece. At first, his fellow Martians tried to help. They offered words of comfort, rituals of healing, guidance to ease the ache, but none of it touched the wound. Magic Man was not simply mourning. He was unraveling. His humor, once sharp but kind, grew bitter. His energy, once inspiring, became chaotic. Instead of lifting others, he began pushing them away. Instead of celebrating life, he mocked it, almost as if daring the universe to admit it had made a mistake in taking Margles. This was the beginning of the collapse, but it didn't look like collapse from the outside. It looked like eccentricity, strange jokes, bizarre pranks, unpredictable behavior. Some whispered that he was simply trying to cope in his own way, keeping the spirit of laughter alive. Others worried that there was something darker brewing, that the pain was twisting him into something unrecognizable, and both, in their own way, were right. Because grief, when left untended, can transform. It can ferment, grow sharp and sour. And that's what was happening inside him. He began to see the world as absurd, as meaningless. If something as beautiful and good as Margles could be taken away without warning, then what was the point of anything? Why strive? Why hope? Why love? And so Magic Man, the once radiant figure of Mars, began to trade in despair. He wore humor as a mask, but behind it was a heart that no longer believed in balance or order. Behind it was a soul that was beginning to collapse under the weight of loss. This was the day everything changed, not only for Magic Man, but for all of Mars. For when a bright light turns into a shadow, the world around it feels the shift. And the Martians, though they could not yet see it fully, were living in the beginning of that long, painful transformation. When we reflect on Magic Man's story, there is always one shadow that looms larger than all others, one moment where everything begins to unravel. The shadow is the loss of Margles. It was not simply the death of a loved one. It was the erasure of the single anchor that tethered him to compassion, to clarity, to hope. Without her, the colors of the universe dulled, and the warmth of his heart cooled into something jagged and cruel. The day Margles was taken from him was not foretold with grand omens or fiery skies. Tragedy rarely announces itself so clearly. In fact, it was a day much like any other, filled with the quiet joys of the shared life. The air on Mars was crisp, thin but breathable, and the domes of glass shimmered in the sunlight. To the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. Magic Man, still brimming with charm and vitality, moved through his duties with purpose. Margles laughed softly at his side, a melody that made even the dullest Martian dust sparkle with life. But then came the strike, swift and merciless. Some tales describe a sudden accident. Others whisper of forces beyond even Mars's control. But in every version, the result is the same. Margles, the light of Magic Man's soul, was ripped from existence. One moment she was there, vibrant and full of life, and the next she was gone, a silence where there should have been music. Imagine for a moment the breath leaving your lungs, not in the natural rhythm of life, but in a single, suffocating instant stolen and never to return. That is the kind of silence that fell upon Magic Man that day. For most people, grief is an ocean. It comes in waves. Some are strong, some gentle, but eventually they recede. Magic Man's grief was not like this. His grief was an endless flood, the kind that drowns everything in its path and refuses to let the waters lower. Instead of finding ways to honor Margles, he began to rot from the inside. The brilliance that once made him a hero turned into a cruel mimicry of itself. It is here, in this tragic shift, that the Magic Man we meet in Adventure Time begins to take shape. He could have crumbled into quiet sorrow, but instead his grief exploded outward. His powers, once used for healing, exploration, and joy, became instruments of chaos. Every spell became a joke, every transformation an act of cruelty. His actions were not the harmless pranks of a mischievous wizard. They were the desperate screams of a man who could no longer reconcile his inner torment with the world around him. Some accounts even say that when Margles was taken, he pleaded with the higher forces of Mars for help. He turned to Glob, and Grodd, the divine entities of his world, But even they could not or would not bring her back. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps it was the laws of the universe. But whatever the reason, the denial only deepened his despair. He was not simply heartbroken. He was betrayed by the very cosmos he had once served. And so he shifted. His mind, once sharp and clever, began to warp. His words turned biting, his laughter hollow, his presence unbearable. Others began to avoid him, unable to face the raw pain that twisted every gesture he made. He became a storm in human form, a tragedy wrapped in the disguise of a jester. To the unknowing eye, he was cruel, erratic, unpredictable. But beneath that surface raged the agony of a man who had lost everything that made life meaningful. What makes his collapse even more heartbreaking is that Margles had been more than just a partner. She was his balance, his compass. She reminded him of the better parts of himself, the parts that loved unselfishly, that reached for beauty, that found joy in the small details of the universe. Without her, those qualities decayed. He was left only with raw power and a void where his heart used to live. This was not just a personal tragedy. It had ripples that spread across Mars and beyond. His fellow Martians saw one of their most brilliant figures descend into chaos. A hero became a nuisance. A guardian became a danger. Where once he had brought pride to their people, now he brought shame. It was a fall so steep that few could even believe it was possible. And yet the saddest part of all was that Magic Man knew it. Deep down, behind his taunts and pranks, he knew exactly how far he had fallen. He was not unaware of his cruelty. He carried it like a torch, brandishing it before the world in defiance of the pain that gnawed at his chest. If he could not have joy, then why should anyone else? If his heart was shattered, why should the hearts of others remain whole? This is how grief twisted him not into a hollow recluse, but into an agent of chaos who believed in his own broken way that spreading misery was the only path left to him. His tragedy became everyone's tragedy, and with each passing year, the remnants of the man who had once loved Margles seemed to fade further into the shadows of madness. The death of Margles is one of those narrative points that doesn't need grand spectacle to hit with the crushing weight. It is almost understated, and that is what makes it so haunting. In Magic Man's story, there was no climactic battle where he valiantly defended her and lost. There was no choice he made that he could wrestle with afterward. She was simply taken, snatched from him in an instant by the cosmic force of Grob Gob Glob Grod's battle against an unknown foe, or as some fans interpret, by the universal chaos that seems to swirl around Mars. That helplessness is at the very core of his collapse. When you cannot direct your anger at an enemy, it begins to eat inward, carving out pieces of the soul until there's little left to hold on to. We see this unfold most clearly in how his magic changes. Before, his powers were vibrant, purposeful, and noble. He used them for healing, for protection, for creation. After Margles, those same hands that once conjured beauty became instruments of chaos. Instead of weaving joy, he created illusions that mocked, twisted, and tormented. Where once he used his gifts to aid others, he now wielded them to reflect his bitterness outward, like a broken mirror cutting into anyone who dared stand too close. It is not that his power grew darker in essence, but that his intention twisted. Magic itself does not judge. It is the wielder who shapes it. And Magic Man, robbed of love, began shaping his with cruelty. There's something almost unbearable in the quiet that follows such a loss. For him, Mars was no longer a home, but a constant reminder of her absence. Every corner of the Martian landscape must have whispered her name. Every achievement that once brought him pride now carried a bitter edge, because what is greatness worth if the person you wanted to share it with is gone? His fellow Martians, perhaps, offered sympathy. But sympathy can often feel hollow when grief has hollowed you out. Instead of comfort, it might have sounded like pity, and pity was the last thing a once heroic wizard wanted to endure. It is here that we begin to see the unraveling of a mind. Madness is not always a sudden break. More often, it is a slow loosening of threads. Magic Man became erratic, unpredictable. His jokes turned cruel, his laughter edged with venom. He began lashing out at those who tried to help, or worse, turning them into subjects of his twisted experiments. The very people he might have once called friends were forced to watch as he spiraled further into despair. Some may have turned away out of fear, others out of sorrow. Either way, his isolation deepened, reinforcing the cycle of bitterness and destruction. The tragedy here is not just that he lost Margles. It is that, in losing her, he also lost himself. The qualities that once defined him, his compassion, his bravery, his creativity, were buried under layers of spite and anger. And yet, in glimpses, you can still sense the ghost of the man he was. It is in the way he talks about her, when he lets his guard down, that you see the remnants of love. That lingering tenderness only makes his cruelty more painful to witness, because it is born from a place of such profound devotion. His torment was not only in Margles being gone, but in his inability to let her go. In the cosmic sense, Mars itself seemed to respond to his decline. Martian society, once proud of its hero, began to see him as a liability, even a threat. His powers were too great, his instability too dangerous. What do you do with a man who can bend reality at a whim, but whose mind is shattering piece by piece? The answer for the Martians was exile. But before that final step, there was the slow crumbling of his role, the stripping away of responsibilities, the quiet shift from leader to outcast. Imagine being Magic Man in those moments. Every honor once bestowed upon you, every gesture of respect, now turned into silence or avoidance. No one daring to meet your eye, as though grief itself was contagious. But perhaps the cruelest part of this collapse is how it turned inward. Magic Man began to rewrite his own story in his mind. Instead of seeing himself as a victim of cosmic tragedy, he started seeing the universe as inherently unjust, malevolent, even laughably absurd. And so he responded in kind. If the world was cruel enough to take Margles, then he would be cruel back. If love could be destroyed in a blink, then he would mock love wherever he saw it. His pranks, his torments, his trickster nature, they were all shields and weapons, ways of lashing out at a universe that had wronged him in the deepest way imaginable. Oh, for us, watching his arc, there's a terrible recognition in this, because who hasn't, at some point, felt the temptation to numb pain with anger? Who hasn't wanted to burn down reminders of what was lost, rather than face the ache directly? Magic Man embodies that temptation, but amplified through the cosmic power. His tragedy is a mirror, showing us what happens when grief hardens into bitterness instead of softening into memory. It is not just sad, it is terrifying, because it reveals how thin the line can be between love and cruelty, between healing and destruction. And as the final threads of his sanity began to unravel, Mars itself could no longer hold him. His breakdown had reached the point where his once noble magic now threatened to undo the very society he once upheld. The day everything changed was not only the day Margles died, it was also the day Mars began to lose Magic Man, not as a hero, but as a soul worth saving. And so the tragedy deepened, not only in its singular event, but in the ripples it sent across the fabric of Ooo and beyond. For Margles' death was not a wound that healed in time, nor a chapter that closed neatly. It was a fracture that widened with every passing year, a crack that ran through Magic Man's heart and splintered into his very identity. The collapse of his mind was not immediate, nor dramatic in the sense of thunder or fire. It was quieter, subtler, and therefore far more dangerous. At first, those who had once admired him may have thought he was coping in his own eccentric way. The Martians perhaps told themselves that grief looked different for everyone. Magic Man's laughter, his odd pranks, his strange new detachment, it could have been mistaken for resilience, for an attempt to mask pain with play. But the truth was that every laugh carried hollowness, every joke was a shield, and every trick was a refusal to face the silence that followed Margles' absence. In the nights after her loss, the once proud hero would wander the quiet deserts of Mars alone. Where once his steps had been purposeful, now they meandered, circling endlessly as if searching for something that was no longer there. His eyes, once lit with conviction, grew tired and wild. Even the stars above, which had once filled him with a sense of cosmic connection, became cruel reminders of the vastness he now faced alone. His powers, too, began to twist with his sorrow. Magic is not separate from the self. In the world of adventure time, it is often a reflection of the user's spirit. When his spirit fractured, so too did his magic. The playful spells, once radiant and clever, turned warped and unsettling. Objects transformed into grotesque versions of themselves, animals twisted into mockeries. He began to create chaos not because he wished to harm, but because order itself reminded him of the life he had lost. To him, breaking the world into nonsense was a way of making the outside match the inside. But for those around him, it was terrifying. The people who had once trusted him as a hero now whispered of his instability. Friends grew distant. Fellow wizards avoided his company. On Mars, whispers spread that Orgolorg's defeat had come at too high a cost, that perhaps in losing Margles, the champion himself had been lost as well. The great hero was becoming a cautionary tale. And Magic Man himself did nothing to stop the decline. In truth, he fed it. His pranks grew crueler, not because he delighted in cruelty, but because cruelty guaranteed a reaction. When you feel numb, sometimes even anger from others is a kind of comfort, a proof that you still exist in someone's eyes. He would transform travelers into absurd shapes, twist landscapes into disorienting puzzles, or play games that ended in tears each time he laughed, but his laughter rang thin, echoing with pain. The day that everything changed, then, was not only the day Margles was taken. It was every day after, when grief calcified into madness. His collapse was not a single fall, but a slow erosion, a crumbling cliff face, losing pieces to the wind and sand until what remained no longer resembled what once stood tall. Mars, that once had revered him, could no longer abide his chaos. The other Martians watched as their brightest sun spiraled into something unrecognizable. It was not only a personal tragedy now, but a public one. A once noble figure was now feared, avoided, and in time rejected. The distance grew, and with it, Magic Man lost the last threads of connection, holding him to his humanity. Imagine, if you will, the silence of a man who had once known the fullness of companionship and the honor of duty, now sitting alone in a barren crater on Mars. The wind whistles across the rocks. The stars shimmer overhead. He sits hunched, muttering jokes to himself, conjuring illusions that no one else will ever see. Sometimes he imagines Margles laughing beside him. Sometimes he conjures her form out of sand and magic, only to watch her dissolve again into nothingness. Each time it happens, he feels that same stab of pain, as fresh as the first day. The collapse was complete when he no longer believed himself capable of love or deserving of it. The tragedy of Magic Man is not just that he lost Margles, but that in losing her, he convinced himself that he had lost all worth. And when a man decides he has nothing left to lose, he becomes capable of anything. From that point on, he was no longer the hero wizard of Mars. He was the trickster of madness, a living testament to how love's absence can twist greatness into ruin. And though the Martians tried to contain him, to discipline him, even to exile him, the truth is that Magic Man had already exiled himself. His world had ended the day Margles was taken, and everything after was a slow, chaotic echo of that loss. As we close this chapter of his story, the image left behind is not one of fire or thunder, but of silence and emptiness. A crater on Mars, a man alone, a laugh that rings hollow under the stars, and with that silence, the tragedy of Magic Man had only just begun to unfold. We're about to wander into one of the strangest stretches of Magic Man's story, a time when his brilliance and heartbreak twisted into something bizarre and unsettling. We've seen him as a hero of Mars. We've seen the tenderness of his love with Margles, and the unshakable devastation that followed when she was gone. Now we step into the aftermath. What happens when grief corrodes the soul, when the sharp edges of genius turn into mischief and cruelty? Tonight, we follow Magic Man into his trickster years. The people of Ooo came to know him not as the hero of Mars, or the man who once carried the burden of defending a planet, but as a nuisance, a tormentor, and, in many ways, a mirror of everything unpredictable in the post-war world. Magic Man became a wandering figure, descending to Earth's ruined surface with powers that could reshape reality at will. But instead of building or healing, he chose chaos. He turned people into things, things into people, animals into absurd hybrids, the ordinary into the ridiculous. At first glance, these tricks might seem comical, like the antics of a mischievous sprite. But for those who lived in Ooo, his magic was not harmless. It unsettled entire communities, turning mornings into puzzles and evenings into nightmares. Imagine waking up to find your house transformed into a giant piece of fruit, or your closest friend turned into a chair. These weren't whimsical jokes with punchlines waiting at the end. They were experiments in chaos, reflections of a mind that had lost its tether to empathy. For Magic Man, each trick seemed to carry the shadow of Margles. Every time he turned someone inside out or flipped their world upside down, he was expressing the torment that never left him. The world hurt him, and so he made sure the world hurt in return. This transformation into a trickster wasn't sudden. It grew out of the deep emptiness Margles' absence left behind. Without her, he had no anchor, no reason to care about the feelings of others. To him, Ooo was just a playground for his despair. His laughter during these tricks wasn't the laughter of joy, but of bitterness. Each joke was a performance of his grief, each prank a cruel reminder of how hollow life had become. He wielded his powers not as gifts, but as weapons against meaning itself. And yet, in a strange way, Ooo came to accept Magic Man as part of its natural order. He was feared, yes, but also regarded with a kind of inevitability. People whispered stories about the golden figure in the wide-brimmed hat who appeared in villages, sowed chaos, and disappeared without a trace. Children told tales of him around campfires, daring each other to laugh when they should be afraid. Adults prayed he would never visit their homes. Still, he lingered on the edges of their imaginations, a legend made real through mischief. We might wonder why the heroes of Ooo, those like Finn, Jake, or even Princess Bubblegum, did not simply stop him. The truth is, Magic Man was almost untouchable. His powers were not just strong, but unpredictable. He could reshape reality faster than a sword could strike. Even Finn, brave as he was, found himself disarmed and baffled whenever Magic Man crossed his path. And what do you do with someone who doesn't want power, wealth, or even recognition, but only wants to unsettle and disturb? How do you fight an enemy whose only motive is to mock the very idea of order? It's worth pausing here to consider how tragedy reshaped him into this version of himself. Magic Man wasn't born a monster. He wasn't even born a prankster. He was made into one through the unrelenting weight of sorrow, through the cruelty of losing the one person who had given his life direction. When we see him tormenting the people of Ooo, it's easy to dismiss him as a villain. But if we look closely, we can see that his mischief was never random, and it was pain wearing the mask of a joke. Every laugh he forced from others carried the echo of the laughter he would never again share with Margles. So in these years of wandering, Magic Man became an almost mythic presence. He was the embodiment of absurdity in a world already cracked by war and time. And yet behind every bizarre trick, behind every chaotic laugh, was a tragedy playing on repeat. The Trickster years were not simply about madness. They were about a broken heart trying to make sense of a senseless universe. Magic Man's descent into the role of Oo's trickster menace was not just about cruelty for cruelty's sake. At first glance, it often looked like his games were childish, little more than bursts of chaos to break up the monotony of existence. Yet when you look closer, there was always something unsettling behind them, as if he were constantly testing the world and perhaps himself to see how much pain he could create before anyone stopped him. In Ooo, beings of incredible power often had at least some purpose. The Ice King, for instance, though erratic, sought companionship. Princess Bubblegum, though controlling at times, worked toward building civilization. Even creatures like the Lich had a dark, singular mission. Magic Man, however, seemed to defy purpose altogether. He floated through the land without allegiance, without loyalty, bound only to his fractured mind. To the people of Ooo, this made him even more frightening, because you could never predict where his madness might land next. He turned adventurers into sandwiches, transformed brave knights into screaming cows, and made rivers flow backward for no reason other than his amusement. To him, life was a series of cruel experiments, and the world was nothing but a toy box waiting to be broken. Yet beneath the bizarre and dangerous laughter, there was always that shadow of sorrow he never acknowledged. His grief over Margles was buried so deeply that it warped into something poisonous, spilling out as these endless pranks of misery. What's fascinating is that some of the people he tormented never quite understood why. Imagine waking up one morning and finding your house upside down, or discovering that your shadow had become its own living, taunting creature. To the victims, it seemed random, but in some way it reflected Magic Man's inner collapse. His world had been turned inside out by loss, so he reflected that disorientation outward, reshaping the lives of others to mirror his own instability. Of course, Finn and Jake were not spared from these games. Magic Man took a special kind of delight in pushing the young hero toward despair. One of the most memorable moments was when he transported Finn into a strange trial, leaving him lost and questioning the meaning of existence itself. It wasn't just a prank. It was psychological warfare. He wanted Finn to feel the same sense of futility he carried, to look into the abyss and wonder whether any of it truly mattered. For Magic Man, spreading despair was the closest thing to sharing his pain. But as cruel as he wasn't without intelligence. His mischief was often carefully designed, as if he wanted to leave echoes of his madness wherever he went. In some ways, he was an artist of suffering, crafting scenarios that forced others to confront absurdity, injustice, or loss. And though most saw only a trickster, deep down he was revealing his own fractured worldview, one where order was meaningless, and love could be ripped away without warning. The people of Ooo adapted in curious ways. Some learned to fear him deeply, changing their routines and even avoiding places he was rumored to visit. Others shrugged it off, muttering that he was simply one of the many bizarre beings who inhabited their already unpredictable world. Yet no one could truly ignore him, because sooner or later, Magic Man always returned. His appearances became like storms, unwelcome, but inevitable, shaping the land and its people with each chaotic visit. Interestingly, though, he never stayed in one place too long. That restlessness, that inability to remain still, hinted again at his deeper tragedy. Staying in one place might mean dwelling on his memories. It might mean letting the grief catch up to him. Instead, he kept moving, scattering his cruelty across the land as if motion itself was his shield against sorrow. He wasn't just running from the people of Ooo, he was running from himself. And yet, as much as his chaos defined him, there were moments, fleeting but real, when something else showed through. A pause in the laughter, a strange silence after a prank, a glimmer of regret in his expression before he twisted it into another cruel smile. These were rare and easy to miss, but they remind us that underneath the madness, a part of the man he once was still lingered. It was buried, suffocated by grief and twisted into bitterness, but it was there all the same. In a strange way, these trickster years were his survival strategy. He couldn't move forward, he couldn't heal. He couldn't let go of Margles. So he embraced madness as a mask, a way to keep functioning in a universe that had shattered his heart. If he couldn't have joy, then he would spread sorrow. If he couldn't laugh with sincerity, then he would laugh at the suffering of others. It was a dark inversion of love turned into cruelty, survival turned into torment. And the question we must ask ourselves is this: was Magic Man truly mad? Or was he painfully aware of what he was doing? Sometimes the line between madness and sorrow is thinner than we'd like to admit. Magic Man's cruelty during these wandering years often carried with it an odd sense of theatricality. He wasn't merely a destructive wizard unleashing spells without thought. He crafted elaborate scenarios, almost like a playwright, staging one absurd performance after another. A mountain might be turned into pudding, only for him to laugh as travelers sank waist-deep into its sticky surface. A humble villager could be transformed into a giant singing fish, flopping helplessly in the town square while Magic Man applauded like a delighted spectator at his own twisted circus. He was both the performer and the audience, and everyone else was forced into roles they never asked to play. What makes this era so fascinating is the way it blurred the lines between comedy and tragedy. Many of his victims would recount their stories with anger or terror, but also with a strange disbelief, as though what had happened was so absurd that it almost didn't feel real. Imagine losing your house not because of fire or flood, but because someone turned it into a giant chicken that clucked and strutted away. That was the sort of nonsense Magic Man unleashed. And while people laughed nervously about it afterward, the sting of destruction remained. It is here that we see the true heart of his madness. He wanted the world to reflect the chaos he felt inside. If he was broken, if he was absurd, then so too should the lives of everyone else. Magic Man's interactions with Finn and Jake during this time are perhaps the clearest windows into his state of mind. He tormented them repeatedly, not out of any specific vendetta, but simply because they were there, symbols of innocence and heroism that he could not stand to witness. Their optimism mocked him, their determination enraged him, and so he turned them into pawns in his endless jokes. Yet there was always something telling in these encounters. Magic Man could have destroyed them completely if he wished. His powers were vast and unpredictable, but he never did. He toyed with them, humiliated them, forced them into impossible situations, yet always left them alive to stew in confusion. That restraint, strange as it may seem, speaks volumes. Deep down, he still held fragments of his old self, shards of the man who once loved Margles, the man who had once been capable of compassion. Those shards never healed, but instead became sharp edges he used against others. During these years, it is also worth noting how Magic Man's sense of humor revealed his inner torment. His jokes were not clever, nor were they truly joyful. They were absurd, grotesque, and often cruel. This was humor as self-destruction, humor as punishment, for daring to keep living after loss. Scholars of Ooo might call it gallows humor taken to the extreme. Every prank was a mirror, showing the audience the ridiculous fragility of their existence. And in his laughter, one could almost hear the echo of his grief for Margles, hidden beneath layers of mockery. He did not laugh because life was funny. He laughed because the alternative was unbearable silence. The Trickster years also show us the loneliness of Magic Man. Despite all his antics, he remained isolated. No one could approach him with kindness, and he refused to accept it, even if they tried. He was a man at war with the very concept of companionship. His only conversations were taunts and riddles, his only connections forged through shared suffering. Imagine how isolating it must have been to exist this way, forever the cause of pain, never the recipient of understanding. It was his own choice, but it was also his prison. By keeping others away with cruelty, he ensured that he would never again face the risk of losing someone he loved. It was a twisted form of protection, both for himself and for anyone who might have tried to reach him. And yet, even in these years of chaos, seeds of change were quietly being planted. Finn and Jake's repeated encounters with him chipped at the walls he had built around his heart. They did not forgive him, but they survived him, and their resilience mattered. Other figures in Ooo came to recognize that behind his madness was a deeper wound. And the forces of Mars, who had once cast him down, continued to watch from afar, waiting for the moment when his story might shift again. In these ways, the Trickster years were not only a chapter of destruction, but also a long, painful road toward transformation. They were the years in which Magic Man lost himself completely and, unknowingly, began to set the stage for the possibility of finding himself again. For centuries, Hunson Abadir roamed Ooo unchecked, a king in all but name. He wielded the power of nightosphere portals, the ability to drain souls, and a cunning tongue that could twist almost any situation in his favor. But even the mightiest beings, no matter how immortal or indestructible they may seem, eventually encounter a shift. A moment that disrupts the trajectory of their story, leaving them weaker, more vulnerable, and perhaps more human. For Hunson, this turning point came not from an external conqueror or a great cosmic force, but from a confrontation with something far closer to home, his daughter, Marceline. At first it might sound odd to say that the great Hunson Abadir, feared across realms, could be brought low by a single person. But that is the essence of the truth. Because what finally began to unravel his dominance wasn't brute strength or magical superiority. It was love, a bond he had dismissed and neglected for so long that it quietly grew into his greatest weakness. Marceline, who had spent centuries forging her own identity, who had carved out her place in Ooo among friends, music, and struggles, would eventually stand at the heart of her father's undoing. We can trace the early cracks in Hunson's invulnerability back to when Marceline first invited him to her world. He arrived as a looming, terrifying figure, eager to consume, to taunt, to remind everyone of the sheer gulf of power that separated him from them. Yet instead of fear, he was met with resistance. Finn and Jake, despite being tiny compared to his size and power, fought him without hesitation. They weren't afraid to call him out, to defend Marceline against her own father. That simple act of defiance planted a seed. Hunson had always been used to compliance, whether through fear, force, or contractual obligation. But suddenly, there were people who could not be swayed by his aura, who cared too deeply about his daughter to allow him free rein. And then came the deeper blow. Marceline herself making it clear that his presence in her life wasn't welcome unless he was willing to treat her differently. She didn't tremble at his power, and she didn't beg for his acceptance. Instead, she demanded respect. That alone stripped him of an advantage he had held over countless others. Marceline's defiance chipped away at his certainty. He could not dominate her, not in the way he did with souls or contracts. His daughter stood as proof that his greatest source of pride, his control, was not absolute. The true turning point, however, came when Hunson's powers themselves were challenged, and in some ways, stripped away. There were moments when the balance shifted dramatically, when Hunson found himself not as a predator, but as prey. One such moment was when Princess Bubblegum and her allies managed to banish him back to the nightosphere. Suddenly, he was cut off from Ooo, from his games, from the influence he craved. He could only watch, from his dark throne, as Marceline's life unfolded without him. That forced distance was not just physical. It weakened him emotionally, eroding his grip on the one tether that tied him to the human world. Hunson's eventual decline can be seen in how he struggled to adapt. In earlier centuries, he had been a force of pure dominance. Later, he began appearing in Ooo as more of a nuisance than an unstoppable juggernaut. The young heroes of the land treated him less like a catastrophic force and more like a recurring villain who could be dealt with. Each failed attempt to assert himself chipped away at the myth of his invulnerability. To Hunson, who thrived on reputation and fear, that was a wound deeper than any sword could give. But perhaps the most important shift was internal. Deep down, he began to realize that power alone would not secure the thing he had always wanted but never admitted: Marceline's affection. And once that realization set in, his immense abilities suddenly felt like shackles. They kept him feared, yes, but also isolated. They made Marceline pull away rather than draw near. In the end, what stripped Hunson Abadir of his power was not just banishment, not just defeat in battle, but the slow recognition that the very tools he relied upon for control were the same things pushing away the person he wanted to hold closest. The day Hansen began to lose wasn't marked by the loss of an artifact or the severing of his magic. It was marked by the moment he finally confronted the truth that even the most unstoppable demon could not force love. And for Hansen, who had always measured his worth through power, that truth was devastating. The moment Hansen's power was stripped from him, a silence fell over Ooo. For centuries, his presence had been like a low hum beneath the surface of the world, an energy that heroes and villains alike instinctively felt. With his connection to the nightosphere severed, that hum vanished, and for the first time, Hansen Abadir was no longer the dark constant of the cosmos. To many, this would sound like good news, yet for Hansen, the emptiness was worse than any punishment. The process itself was not dramatic in the way most would imagine. There was no thunder crashing or world-shattering explosion. Instead, it was quiet, subtle, and humiliating. One day he reached for his powers to bend reality to his will, and they were simply gone. His clawed hands flickered with a faint glow that fizzled out before it could take form. His ability to summon portals opened into nothing but air. His voice, once heavy with supernatural command, sounded like any mortal stripped of the resonance that had once made mountains tremble. For a man who had built his entire existence on dominance and fear, this sudden weakness was like being thrown into the cold ocean with no way to swim. Hansen staggered under the weight of it. He had always believed his power was his essence, that without it, he was nothing. And now that belief seemed painfully true. What followed were days of denial. He told himself it was temporary, a mere hiccup in the cosmic balance. He would pace in circles, muttering about rituals, about forgotten incantations, about ancient pacts he might have neglected. He even attempted to contact the nightosphere itself, roaring into the void, demanding his birthright be restored. But the void did not answer. Not even a whisper came back to him. Then came the anger. This phase was dangerous not because Hansen was powerful, but because he no longer had the means to unleash it. Without his powers, his rage burned inward. He smashed his fists into walls until they bled. He tried to intimidate lesser beings, as he always had, only to watch them stare back at him with newfound boldness. What had once been instinctive submission turned to mockery. He was no longer Hansen Abadir, the feared ruler of the nightosphere. He was just a shadow of that name, a man without the terror that defined him. Yet it was in this anger that another realization began to dawn. If he could not inspire fear with raw power, then what was left? What did he truly have? Hansen was forced to face the parts of himself he had long buried beneath his identity as the demon lord. He thought of Marceline. He thought of the choices he had made, the times he had turned away from her, the excuses he had crafted. And for the first time, there was no surge of dark energy to drown those thoughts out. His power had always been a shield, a wall against reflection. Without it, Hansen was left standing in the wreckage of his own conscience. There were whispers across Ooo that Hansen had finally been defeated. Some believed heroes like Finn or Princess Bubblegum had orchestrated this downfall. Others suspected the cosmic entities Prismo, Death, even the mysterious Galb had finally decided to intervene. No one really knew the truth, and perhaps even Hansen himself did not. All he understood was that he was alone, powerless, and confronted with a choice he had never imagined: to rebuild himself without the nightosphere, or to collapse into nothingness. The strangest part of this powerless era was how the world treated him. He was no longer a looming threat, and so for the first time, he experienced what it meant to simply exist, to walk through a village unnoticed, to be spoken to not as a tyrant, but as another being. At first he hated it. He sneered at the mortals who dared speak to him without trembling. But over time he realized there was something profoundly unfamiliar and perhaps even freeing about not being feared. It was not redemption. Not yet. Hunson was far too entrenched in his own pride and past sins to suddenly transform. But the seed was planted. Powerless, he began to experience fragments of humility, of perspective. He saw how fragile life truly was, how much of it depended not on domination, but on connection. And in that fragile state, memories of Margles resurfaced more strongly than ever. The way she had smiled without fear, the way she had spoken to him as though he were more than the Nightosphere's tyrant. The memory haunted him, but also guided him. It suggested that perhaps there was something left to salvage, something worth becoming even without the shadows that had defined him for so long. Hunson's greatest test was no longer holding on to power. It was learning how to live without it. The story of Ice King's stripping away of power was not just about him losing his crown. It was about him losing the only anchor that kept his fractured identity somewhat intact. Without it, he was Simon Petrikov again. But not the man who once loved archaeology. The man who cared deeply for Margles, or the man who valued knowledge above greed. No, he was Simon without the stability of the crown, and without the insulation of madness. It was as if all his losses and memories had come crashing back into him at once, raw and unbearable. We saw this most clearly in moments where Ice King was vulnerable, when the surface of his comical persona cracked and Simon shone through. The best example is in the episode where Marceline takes away his crown, determined to free him from the madness. Her heart is in the right place, but the result is devastating. Without the crown, Simon collapses. He is weak, fragile, gasping for breath like a drowning man pulled too suddenly to the surface. All at once, centuries of suppressed memory return to him. He remembers Margles. He remembers the promise he made to protect her. He remembers the weight of the world falling apart during the Mushroom War. He remembers Marceline, small and trembling, begging him not to leave her. These memories aren't scattered anymore. They are sharp, clear, and painful. It is here that we see Simon not as a mad wizard or a comical nuisance, but as a tragic man stripped bare. He tells Marceline in broken words that without the crown, he will die. That the magic that twisted him into the Ice King is the same thing that has kept him alive all these years. And in that admission lies the cruelest irony of all. The very thing that destroyed his mind also preserved his body. Without the curse, he cannot survive. His power is both poison and lifeline. For Marceline, this is unbearable. To save Simon's life, she must return the crown to him, knowing full well it will once again take away his sanity. The heartbreaking decision she makes reveals the depth of their bond. She chooses to let him live, even if it means watching him slip back into the role of Ice King, babbling nonsense, chasing princesses, and losing himself again. For her, some part of Simon, no matter how small, is better than no Simon at all. This turning point reveals the fragile balance of Simon's existence. He is trapped in a paradox, kept alive by the very curse that destroyed his humanity. Stripping him of his power doesn't free him, it only exposes the unbearable weight of his suffering. And when the crown is returned, the madness comes rushing back, wrapping him once more in its fog. From the outside, it looks like regression. But to Marceline, to those who know him, it is an act of mercy, however painful it may be. It is worth noting how the show portrays this moment. The animation slows down, the colors turn softer, more muted. Ice King's voice loses its frantic, comical pitch and becomes weary, quiet, deeply human. These subtle changes remind us that beneath the mask of absurdity is a man whose story is a tragedy. We are reminded that every time Ice King babbles about princesses, there is a Simon somewhere underneath, suffocating, clinging to fragments of memory. And when stripped of power, those fragments burst forth, leaving him raw and exposed. This theme of power as both curse and crutch is central to Ice King's arc. For most characters in Adventure Time, power is something to be desired, wielded, or abused. But for Simon, power is survival itself. Take it away, and he is doomed. Leave it with him, and he suffers in madness. It's a no-win scenario, the ultimate tragic fate. But within this tragedy is also the seed of compassion. Stripping away his power allows others, like Marceline, Finn, and Jake, to glimpse the real Simon. They see that he is not merely a nuisance or an enemy, but a broken man fighting for scraps of himself. This shift transforms how we, as the audience, view him too. We stop laughing at his antics quite so freely. We stop dismissing him as just comic relief. We recognize him as one of the deepest, most human characters in the entire series. Another fascinating element of this turning point is how it forces Ice King to confront his own awareness. There are moments when Simon surfaces just long enough to realize what he has become. Imagine that horror being lucid for a brief moment, only to see yourself through the eyes of others, to realize that you have spent centuries as a fool, mocked, pitied, and avoided, to understand that the friends you once had are gone. The love of your life vanished into the void, and the only person who still truly cares for you is watching you fall apart again. These moments of clarity cut deeper than madness ever could. This duality of clarity and collapse is essential to understanding the tragedy of Simon Petrikov. Stripped of power, he is a man undone by his memories. Bound to the crown, he is a man undone by madness. There is no middle ground, no peaceful resolution in this stage of his story, and that makes his arc all the more powerful. When the crown was gone, the reality of who Simon was came rushing back in, heavy and suffocating. The memories that had been suppressed under centuries of enchantment were no longer locked away. He remembered Margles. He remembered Betty. He remembered every desperate choice he had made since that fateful day in the aftermath of the Mushroom War. It was as if a floodgate had burst open, and suddenly he was left carrying the weight of an entire lifetime of loss, regret, and brokenness. And this, perhaps, was the cruelest twist of all. Simon had spent so long consumed by the crown that he often forgot who he really was, but the moment he was free of its grip, the clarity of his humanity did not feel like a gift. It felt like a punishment. For all those years of madness, at least there had been a veil, a barrier between him and the crushing truth. Now, naked before his own conscience, Simon was forced to face everything he had done. He was forced to acknowledge every soul he had frightened, every bond he had shattered, every chance at peace that had slipped away. This new clarity didn't come with peace. It came with a hollow emptiness. He wasn't the noble man he once hoped to be. He wasn't the wise and gentle caretaker Marceline remembered from her childhood. He wasn't even the powerful wizard who could reshape Ooo in an instant. He was just Simon Petrikov, a man who had lost too much and gained nothing, a man who no longer belonged in the time he found himself living in. There is a striking sadness to Simon's turning point that makes it more profound than any magical battle or cosmic struggle. For so long, Ice King had seemed like a nuisance, a comical figure, or at worst, a tragic villain. But when he was stripped of that identity, all that remained was a fragile human being. It revealed something deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes the mask of madness is easier to live with than the pain of reality. What did Simon do with this new self? At first he wandered, unsure of who he was supposed to be. Without the crown, there was no magic to protect him, no false bravado to shield him. He was vulnerable in every sense of the word, and in a world like Ooo, vulnerability was dangerous. But worse than the dangers outside was the storm inside his own mind. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was a relic of the past, a man pulled from a history that had long since turned to dust. It was Marceline who once again provided a tether. Though their relationship had been fractured by his years as Ice King, she saw the fragile humanity still flickering within him. She knew better than anyone the scars he carried because she too had survived the wreckage of the old world. Their bond, though complicated, was still rooted in love and understanding. And in those moments, Simon had at least one anchor keeping him from drifting too far into despair. But Betty was the name that weighed on him most of all. Free from the crown, he could finally think of her without the fog of madness distorting his thoughts. And thinking of her was agony. He remembered her brilliance, her laughter, her loyalty. He remembered how she had loved him without hesitation, and how he had lost her in the chaos of his obsession with the crown. For Simon, the greatest cruelty of regaining his humanity was not simply remembering her. It was remembering that he had failed her. Betty herself was not absent from the story, of course. In her own way, she became entangled in the same cycle of sacrifice and madness that had consumed Simon. When she returned, determined to save him, her choices reflected his own in haunting symmetry. Where Simon had once sacrificed his sanity to wield the crown, Betty sacrificed her very self to alter the course of his fate. It was love twisted into desperation, and it showed how deeply their stories were intertwined, even in tragedy. The turning point of being stripped of power was not a neat resolution. It didn't restore Simon to the life he had once lived, nor did it erase the centuries of havoc Ice King had unleashed. What it did was lay bare the truth, that beneath all the layers of magic and madness, Simon was still human, still broken, still capable of love and regret and longing. And that truth made him more complex, more fragile, and more real than ever before. For many fans, this moment was the one that redefined the character entirely. No longer just a figure of comic relief or a strange villain, lingering on the edges of the story, Simon became one of the most tragic and human characters in the entire Adventure Time universe. His story wasn't about conquering kingdoms or collecting treasures. It was about surviving grief, about clinging to the memory of love, and about trying to find meaning when everything else has been taken away. This was the turning point because it stripped away all illusions. There was no crown to hide behind, no magical power to distort his reality. Only Simon, raw and unshielded, staring into the endless expanse of a world that no longer felt like his own. And in that moment, the story shifted from being about Ice King, the foolish wizard of Ooo, to Simon Petrikov, the man who had lost everything, but was still searching for a way to live. That shift would shape the path of his story from here on out. It was the seed of what would come next, the fragile journey of rediscovery, the desperate search for connection, and the haunting shadow of choices made out of love. Simon's turning point wasn't the end. It was the quiet beginning of something even more difficult, the long, uncertain road of living without the crown. When the crown was taken from Magic Man and the last traces of its curse finally dissolved from his mind, what was left behind was someone who could hardly recognize himself. For centuries he had been a godlike trickster, feared and despised in equal measure, a living storm of grief and cruelty. And yet when all that power was stripped away, what remained was not a monster at all, but a man. Just a man. That was the beginning of normal man. The transformation was not merely magical. It was spiritual, psychological, and deeply personal. Imagine being haunted by every choice you've ever made, suddenly no longer hidden behind layers of enchantment and madness. Normal man had to face himself in a way that magic man never could. He had to look directly at the wreckage he had caused, at the memories of his lost wife Margles, and at the faces of those he had hurt with his tricks. Without the magic to shield him, the weight of it all settled squarely on his shoulders. He had been given what he once mocked most, the chance to be human again. It's worth pausing here to consider how rare this is in the world of Ooo. Very few characters, after so much destruction, are given the opportunity to start over. Villains are often defeated, banished, or consumed by their own darkness. But normal man's story is one of redemption, though redemption in Adventure Time is never simple. He could not erase what he had done. He could not undo centuries of cruelty. But he could choose to walk a different path, even if it meant stumbling, falling, and getting back up again. One of the first things we see after his transformation is how much smaller he becomes. Without his magic, normal man is physically diminished, no longer towering above others with overwhelming presence. He blends in, unremarkable compared to the sorcerers, princesses, and cosmic entities around him. This shrinking was symbolic. Power had always defined magic man, but as normal man, his journey would be about something else entirely: humility. The path forward was no longer about bending others to his will, but about learning how to live with them. At first, normal man struggled with the sheer awkwardness of existing without magic. Tasks that had once been effortless now required patience and effort. Walking instead of flying, climbing instead of teleporting, speaking plainly instead of conjuring illusions. These small challenges highlighted just how dependent he had been on his powers, and now, stripped of them, he had to learn the most basic skills of being mortal. And yet, in these little struggles, there was also the possibility of growth. Each step forward brought him closer to a kind of healing that magic had always denied him. Perhaps the most moving part of his transformation was his change in attitude toward others. Normal man, unlike magic man, was capable of kindness. It was not always easy. The habits of cruelty and sarcasm lingered in his words like echoes of his old self. But there was sincerity behind his efforts now. He began reaching out, trying to connect with others rather than torment them. In some cases, he attempted to make amends, though forgiveness was not easily given. In other moments, he simply tried to listen, to be present, and to learn from those around him. One of the first bonds he formed was with Tiny Manicore. At first glance, Tiny Manicore was not the most obvious companion for someone in need of redemption. The creature was proud, self-centered, and prone to dramatic declarations. But perhaps that was precisely why they understood each other. Tiny Manicore, like normal man, was struggling with identity and pride, trying to assert a sense of importance in a world that often overlooked him. Together, they became unlikely friends, balancing each other in ways that neither expected. Normal man's humility softened Tiny Manicore's arrogance, while Tiny Manticore's fierce loyalty gave normal man the encouragement he desperately needed. Their partnership also symbolized a larger theme in Adventure Time, the idea that healing often happens in community. Normal man could not have rebuilt himself entirely on his own. He needed connection, the reflection of others to remind him who he was trying to be. Just as Finn and Jake found strength in their brotherhood, And just as Marceline and Simon's bond anchored them through centuries of pain, normal man, too, needed someone by his side. And in tiny Manticore, he found that spark. But healing is never linear. Even as normal man tried to do better, the weight of guilt remained heavy. Memories of Margles in particular haunted him. For so long, Magic Man had twisted his grief into bitterness, using it as an excuse for cruelty. Now, without magic to distract him, normal man was left to feel the raw ache of her absence. He could not trick himself out of mourning anymore. He had to face it directly. And in that sorrow, there was something strangely liberating. By acknowledging his loss, he was finally able to begin the process of truly grieving. In many ways, normal man's new identity was a quiet apology to Margles. He could not bring her back, but he could live differently in her honor. He could choose kindness over cruelty, humility over arrogance, and connection over isolation. This did not erase the past, but it did allow him to honor her memory in a way that Magic Man never could. Leaving behind the shattered remnants of his old life, Magic Man, now stripped of that title, took on a new name. He called himself Normal Man. It was a simple name, almost laughably plain when you considered the cosmic chaos he had once embodied. But that was the point. For the first time in countless centuries, he was not trying to be larger than life. He was not bending the rules of magic, nor terrorizing kingdoms with his cruelty. He was trying, in the most awkward and clumsy way possible, to live a life that was small, fragile, and human. Yet healing was never going to be straightforward. Imagine living centuries defined by anger and destruction, and then suddenly being forced to sit with your thoughts. There were no magic tricks to escape this time, no illusions to hide behind. He had to feel everything, the guilt, the grief, the loneliness. Every night was quiet, too quiet, and in those moments, the memories of Margles returned most sharply. Sometimes he would speak to the stars, asking if she could still hear him. Sometimes he would break down, his body racked with sobs that nobody else was around to see. And sometimes, in rare moments, he would feel a kind of peace, as though the act of surviving without the armor of magic was its own strange victory. Normal man's journey was shaped by humility, but it was also shaped by the relationships he stumbled into along the way. In one of the most unlikely turns, he found a sense of family with tiny Manticore, a creature who had once despised him with every fiber of its being. Tiny Manticore had every reason to hate Normal Man, after all. He had been one of Magic Man's many victims, trapped and tormented like a pet for amusement. But when Magic Man changed, when his cruelty was stripped away, Tiny Manticore saw something unexpected. He saw weakness. He saw vulnerability. And strangely enough, he also saw the possibility of redemption. Their dynamic was awkward at first, almost hostile. Tiny Manticore never missed a chance to remind Normal Man of the pain he had caused, of the terrible deeds he had committed. But instead of lashing out, Normal Man accepted it. He let those words sink in. He let himself be humbled by them. And little by little, a fragile trust began to form. In the process, Normal Man learned something profound. Forgiveness does not arrive as a gift. It is earned, step by step, through patience and the willingness to show up again and again, even when the other person resists. Another turning point came when Normal Man returned to the Martian people, the very people he had once abandoned and mocked in his madness. When they first saw him stripped of his powers, they laughed. How could they not? The once feared trickster, who had wielded cosmic magic like a toy, now stood before them as nothing more than a man. But Normal Man didn't lash out. He didn't curse them or try to prove his superiority. Instead, he bowed his head and admitted his wrongs. He asked for the chance to help, not as a ruler or a sorcerer, but simply as one of them. And though the Martians were skeptical, they eventually gave him that chance. Slowly he became part of their rebuilding efforts. He carried stones, he tended to small tasks, he listened more than he spoke. For someone who had lived centuries as a godlike figure, it was almost absurd. But it was also healing. Every act of labor, every small contribution, was a piece of penance. And though he never fully erased the harm he had done, he showed his people that even the most broken soul could change if they truly wanted to. This phase of his life also marked the beginning of something new, laughter without cruelty. Where once he had mocked others with biting sarcasm, now he laughed gently with them. Where once he had been the trickster spreading chaos, now he was the oddball friend who still stumbled socially, but was trying to connect in earnest. And that difference, though subtle, was enormous. It was a reminder that humor could heal just as easily as it could wound. In many ways, Normal Man's journey of healing was about learning to live without shortcuts. Magic had once given him the power to bend reality, to avoid pain, to mask sorrow. Without it, he had no choice but to confront himself directly. And though that confrontation was painful, it was also transformative. Healing was not quick. It was not easy. But step by step, through humility, forgiveness, and connection, he carved out a life that was more meaningful than any illusion he had conjured in the past. As Normal Man tried to build his new identity, one of the most defining moments of his healing journey came when he crossed paths with Finn and Jake again. At first, there was tension. They remembered the things he had done, the chaos he had caused, and the way he had manipulated entire kingdoms just for fun. But what surprised them was how different he seemed now. He wasn't floating above them like a god or cackling with uncontrollable laughter. He wasn't demanding worship or playing cruel games. He was standing there, nervously fiddling with his hands, uncertain but present. For Finn, who had always believed that people could change, this was a moment of hope. For Jake, ever more skeptical, it was a test. Could someone who had been so twisted truly become something better? Their interaction revealed something important about Normal Man. For the first time, he was willing to admit his mistakes without excuses. He told them that he regretted many of the things he had done, even if he couldn't undo them. He acknowledged the pain he had caused and the bridges he had burned. Most of all, he admitted that he was scared of backsliding, scared of loneliness, scared that maybe deep down he was still Magic Man pretending to be better. That raw honesty was new. It was uncomfortable, but it was genuine. And it marked the slow beginning of his acceptance into the world as someone trying, however clumsily, to be good. The road wasn't smooth. There were moments where old habits crept in. His sense of humor was still offbeat, and sometimes he fell back into trickster-like behaviors, teasing people in ways that could sting. But the difference was intent. Before, he had relished cruelty. Now, if he noticed that he had hurt someone, he tried to make amends. Sometimes he failed. Sometimes he succeeded. But what mattered was the effort. That was what set him apart from the man he used to be. Healing wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. One of the most tender parts of his journey involved his relationships with others who were themselves broken or searching for meaning. Normal Man often gravitated toward those who didn't fit in, perhaps because he saw himself reflected in them. He offered clumsy advice, cracked strange jokes, or simply listened, and in doing so, he discovered something new. Helping others helped him. It filled the emptiness left behind when his magic and arrogance had been stripped away. In giving pieces of himself to others, he slowly rebuilt his own sense of worth. It was almost poetic where once he had drained the joy out of others, now he was giving some of it back. The crown jewel of this healing process, however, was his evolving relationship with Glob, or rather, his acceptance of life after Glob. For so long, Magic Man had lived in his brother's shadow, then in his brother's absence. His grief had consumed him, defined him, and fueled his cruelty. But as normal man, he began to realize that his life didn't have to be a monument to Glob's memory. He didn't need to constantly measure himself against the standard of perfection he believed his brother embodied. Instead, he could honor Glob by living, by trying to do better, and by embracing the messiness of being imperfect. In many ways, that was a more powerful tribute than any act of vengeance or despair could ever be. It's worth pausing here to reflect on what makes Normal Man's story so powerful in the grander tapestry of Adventure Time. In a world filled with cosmic entities, magical beings, and timeless battles between good and evil, Normal Man's arc is surprisingly human. His story isn't about epic battles or world-shattering stakes. It's about grief, guilt, growth, and the long, winding road toward redemption. It's about the struggle to forgive oneself when forgiveness feels impossible. And perhaps most importantly, it's about the courage to live on when it would be easier to give up. Even though he wasn't the most important character in the grand plot of Ooo, Normal Man stood as a quiet reminder that everyone has the capacity to change. No matter how dark their past, no matter how destructive their actions, there is always a chance, however slim, to start again. That doesn't erase the harm, and it doesn't make the journey easy, but it makes it meaningful. Normal Man's life became a testament to this truth. His small acts of kindness, his willingness to stumble and rise again, and his persistent pursuit of something resembling peace made his journey deeply relatable, even in a fantastical world. In some ways, the most striking thing about his transformation is how subtle it is. He doesn't suddenly become a hero like Finn, or a protector like Bubblegum, or a sage like Prismo. Instead, he becomes someone ordinary, someone flawed, someone human. And that ordinariness is what makes his redemption shine. By stepping down from godhood and choosing to walk among mortals, he found something more valuable than infinite power. He found connection. And yet, despite all these strides, his journey wasn't complete. Healing rarely is. The past has a way of echoing through the present, reminding us of where we've been. For Normal Man, those echoes often came at night, in quiet moments when doubt crept in. But those were the moments that tested him most, and those were the moments where he proved again and again that he could choose to move forward. Normal Man's redemption was not measured in one grand act, but in countless small choices. Each day he chose to care rather than to harm, to listen rather than to shout, to guide rather than to dominate. And yet, even in the simpler life, he was never free from memory. The echoes of his time as Magic Man often rose like unwanted guests in the quiet. He would be walking under a soft sky, carrying fruit to a friend, when suddenly he would remember the terror on the face of someone he had once tricked. The laughter he used to unleash so freely in his cruelty now haunted him. Instead of making him collapse, however, those memories gave him resolve. They reminded him not of what he had lost, but of how far he had come. This is one of the most moving parts of his story, the understanding that redemption does not mean erasure. He could not undo what he had done. He could not bring back Margles or wipe away centuries of pain he had caused. But he could choose day after day to live differently. That was his power now. It was smaller than the magic he once wielded, but in many ways it was stronger. When normal man reached the top of a mountain, far from Ooo, he looked out across the world. There were forests, breathing in quiet winds, rivers rolling calmly to the sea, and towns glowing softly in twilight. It was a world he had once wanted to twist into a plaything. But in that moment, he felt only gratitude that it existed outside his control. The world was not his to own or manipulate. It was his to live within. He sat down, watching the horizon blur into stars, and smiled. That smile was fragile, perhaps, but it was real. Later, when we see him helping his brother Glob in Normal Man, there is a striking gentleness in the way he accepts responsibility. He knows he is seen as foolish by many, perhaps even weak, and yet instead of fighting against that image, he embraces it. Foolishness, after all, was a kind of freedom. He no longer needed to perform the role of the all-powerful trickster. He no longer needed the world to kneel before his displays of magic. He could be small, he could be simple, and in that, he found peace. What makes Normal Man's story so deeply human is that it mirrors the journeys we all take. We each carry regrets, mistakes, moments we wish we could undo. And though we may long for some magic to erase the past, the truth is, healing is not about erasure. It is about growth. It is about letting the pain sit alongside the joy and still choosing to move forward. That is what Normal Man teaches us. He is no longer the cosmic prankster, nor the grieving husband, nor the powerful wizard lost in madness. He is just a person, learning to live one day at a time. By the end of his story, we see that he has become something rare in the world of Ooo, content. Not grand, not feared, not even widely admired, just content. And for a character who once lived to cause chaos and destruction, that is a remarkable transformation. In his quiet life, he shows us that sometimes the greatest victories are not the battles we win, but the selves we soften into. And so, as we close this story, imagine Normal Man resting beneath the gentle sky, perhaps humming a tune that only he remembers. His journey has been long and painful, filled with loss, madness, and regret. Yet in the end, it has led him to something simple and precious: peace. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through the life of Normal Man, once Magic Man, the Trickster of Ooo. His story reminds us that no matter how dark our path has been, there is always the chance to begin again. Now, as you drift off to sleep, let the quiet lessons of his life wrap around you. Breathe deeply, let the day fall away, and carry with you the gentle truth that healing is always possible. Good night.